The screen is black. A single sound breaks the silence, the muffled strike of a shovel against damp earth. Then another. Then another. A low hum of strings creeps in, trembling as though the music itself fears what comes next. Beneath Charleston's gilded skyline of church spires and ship masts, beneath the polished parlors and flickering candle chandeliers, a shadow was moving. The shadow did not walk in daylight. It waited. It watched. And when it struck, there was no blood, no blade, no fire. Only silence. Imagine this. You are a man of wealth, seated at your supper table. The air smells of roast duck and tobacco smoke. The voices of your guests rise and fall in laughter. Servants move quietly, invisible, like furniture given life. But then one night you fail to return. Your wine glass is left untouched on the table, your bed still made, your carriage never seen again. No duel, no drowning, no fever explains your absence. Weeks pass. Whispers bloom. Your wife searches the docks, your sons post notices, the constables walk the taverns. Still no trace. And then months later, another man vanishes. Then another. Then another. 9 in total, all men of wealth and cruelty, all erased from Charleston's glittering world as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. But the earth did not act alone. It had a hand. A quiet, patient hand. That hand belonged to Solomon. He was no conjurer, no phantom, no nightmare born of superstition. He was a man in chains, a man who wore silence like armor, who had spent decades learning the weight of wood, stone, and soil. And when he rose against his masters, he did not use the weapons of rebellion. He built something more terrifying. He built tombs. One by one he buried them alive. Some beneath walls, bricked in cellars they themselves had ordered built. Some in shallow foundations, swallowed by soil meant to cradle houses of wealth. One in a well, stones crashing down until darkness was complete. And the last, a judge, sealed upright beneath Charleston's cobblestones, his mouth frozen wide, filled with dirt. 9 men lost. 9 families ruined. 9 voices smothered in earth. The city would whisper his name like a curse. And when children heard the story, they lay awake at night, staring at their ceilings, imagining soil pressing down, pressing in, until breath itself was stolen. Charleston was a city that thought it owned silence. It whipped it into backs, chained it into mouths, built mansions upon it. But Solomon turned silence into his weapon. And in that silence, Charleston began to choke. So tonight we unearth the truth. We descend into the humid streets of 1807 Charleston, a city of chandeliers and chains, prayers and whips, wealth and terror. We will walk in the footsteps of Solomon, the enslaved carpenter who transformed patience into punishment, silence into suffocation, and the earth itself into the only judge that dared listen to him. This is not only the story of one man's revenge. It is the story of a city built on graves, a city that feared the very people it claimed to own, and a city that learned too late that the dead do not always wait for justice. The screen fades from black. A dim lantern flickers in a cellar. The camera pushes forward into the shadows as though entering a tomb. This is the buried history of Solomon's revenge. The soundscape shifts. From the silence of the cellar, we rise into the streets above. Hooves striking cobblestone. The cry of gulls over the harbor. The air, heavy with humidity, carries the mingled scents of tar, tobacco, salt, and sweat. Charleston, South Carolina. The year is 1807. On paper, it is the jewel of the South. Its streets are wide and ordered, lined with Georgian and Federal-style homes. Whitewashed facades gleam in the sun, their columns rising like marble ribs, supporting porches draped with magnolia and jasmine. Grand staircases climb from the street to heavy double doors, each adorned with brass knockers in the shape of lions' heads. But beauty here is deceit. Beneath those porches and verandas lie trapdoors that lead down into storage cellars, dark and damp. Behind the manicured gardens stand slave quarters, long, narrow buildings of wood or brick, their windows shuttered, their air thick with the scent of bodies packed too close. Every street is a contradiction. Luxury standing hand in hand with suffering. Music drifting from a harpsichord in a parlor, while behind the walls a child cries from hunger. Charleston is the richest city in America's South at this time. It is the hub of the rice trade, the indigo trade, the cotton trade. Ships crowd the harbor, their sails snapping in the Atlantic winds, unloading barrels of sugar and molasses, loading again with bales of cotton that will clothe Europe. But the wealth that fills these streets, the chandeliers that glow in these homes, the silver goblets raised in toast, all of it rests upon the backs of the enslaved. Nearly half of Charleston's population in 1807 are enslaved Africans or their descendants. Out of 20,000 souls in the city, almost 10,000 live not in freedom but in bondage. Their presence is everywhere, though the city pretends otherwise. At dawn, enslaved men haul water from wells, their bare feet slapping against cobblestones still slick with dew. Women carry baskets balanced on their heads, filled with vegetables grown in soil tilled by their own hands, yet sold for another man's profit. Children, scarcely tall enough to reach a broom, sweep the thresholds of homes that will never belong to them. The city breathes through their labor. And yet, Charleston teaches its white citizens to see them not as people, but as shadows, tools, possessions. The laws are cruelly precise. Enslaved people are forbidden to gather after dark without permission. They cannot read or write under penalty of whipping. They may not strike a white person even in defense. A slave's testimony in court holds no weight against that of a white man. Charleston is a city in love with its own order, and that order rests on fear. Patrols walk the streets at night, lanterns in hand, searching for enslaved men who dare wander without passes. Whips crack in public squares as punishments so that all might see and all might remember. The masters know the terror they have built. They speak of it often in the privacy of their parlors, the fear of revolt. For Charleston has already tasted it. In 1739, the Stono Rebellion saw enslaved men rise with stolen weapons, striking down their oppressors before being killed themselves. Since then, every whisper, every missing tool, every silence in the fields is met with suspicion. By 1807, this fear hums beneath the city's surface like a low drum. White masters dine with laughter, but their eyes flick often to doors, to shadows, to the quiet figures moving through their homes. They know that should the enslaved ever choose to act, the city would burn. And yet wealth blinds them. They continue to build, to flaunt, to drink deep of the profits torn from human bondage. They decorate their parlors with imported carpets and French porcelain. They boast of their daughters' dowries, their sons' education abroad. They speak of the future with pride, believing it secure. But beneath their feet, in the dark cellars, in the fields by the river, in the narrow slave quarters where air is stifling and silence is demanded, another kind of future is taking shape. It is in these shadows that Solomon lived. By day he was a carpenter. His hands shaped wood for the very houses that flaunted Charleston's grandeur. He laid beams, cut planks, mended fences, carved mantles. Masters trusted him with tools, with timber, with the structures that kept their wealth standing. But by night or in silence between orders, Solomon studied. Not from books, those were forbidden, but from wood itself, from stone, from soil. He learned how walls carried weight, how foundations pressed downward, how air grew scarce when sealed. He watched the city obsess over security, locks on doors, bolts on shutters, bars on windows. But he knew their greatest weakness was beneath them. Every house, every cellar, every pit of earth could be turned against them. In Charleston, the enslaved were told they were powerless. But Solomon had already seen the truth. Power was not in the whip, nor in the law, nor in the silver coins exchanged in markets. Power was in patience. Power was in silence. And patience had been forced upon him his whole life. So when Charleston's masters laughed, when they clinked glasses in candlelight, when they strode across their polished wooden floors, Solomon was already imagining how those same floors might one day collapse, how those walls might close in, how that soil outside might press down. The city thought it knew fear. But true fear was still waiting. Waiting beneath the cobblestones. Waiting in the cellars. Waiting in the hands of a man who would turn their own world into their grave. The camera leaves Charleston's glittering streets and turns inward into shadow. The sound of a rasp dragging across wood, the thud of a mallet, the soft rhythm of a saw. A single lantern sways, throwing long shapes across timber beams. A man works in silence. His name was Solomon. We do not know the name he was born with. That name, given by his mother, spoken in lullabies, was stolen the moment he was sold. In the ledgers of Charleston's traders, he appears only as Solomon, age 12, male, strong, teeth good. He came from the Combahee River swamps, a place where rice grew thick and water choked the land. He was purchased young, too young to understand the bargain struck with his body, but old enough to remember his mother's hands pried away from his own. The wagon that carried him to Charleston also carried silence, for he would never see her again. In Charleston, Solomon was chosen for his strength, but shaped for his skill. Not every enslaved boy was given tools. Most were sent to fields where rice water rotted their skin and mosquitoes carried fevers. But Solomon's hands were steady, his eyes sharp. A master noticed. He was placed with a carpenter. There, his education began. Not letters, not books, for those were forbidden. His alphabet was the grain of oak, the curve of iron nails, the language of weight and balance. He learned how beams groaned under pressure, how mortar hardened into stone, how a wall, if mislaid, could collapse and bury a man before he drew breath again. By 20, Solomon had become indispensable. Masters trusted him to repair their staircases, to carve their mantels, to raise walls around their gardens. He was allowed to move between estates and city houses, carrying his tools in a wooden chest. This freedom, slight as it was, gave him something rarer than gold, knowledge. He saw the inside of Charleston's finest homes. He noted which cellars were damp, which walls were weak, which gardens sank into soft soil. He watched masters drunk, careless, cruel. He heard their secrets as they spoke freely before him, forgetting the quiet man sanding wood in the corner was listening. Solomon learned patience in silence. He had no choice. For 30 years he bore the lash, the insults, the endless humiliations of a world that demanded his obedience yet relied on his skill. His back carried scars, long ropes of flesh twisted by whips. His hands bore calluses as thick as bark. But his eyes, always his eyes, betrayed something more. People said Solomon's gaze lingered too long, not with defiance but with calculation. He looked at a man the way a carpenter studies timber, as though measuring its strength, its flaws, and how easily it might be cut. His masters praised his work. They called him trustworthy, dependable, silent. They did not know silence was a mask. Behind it burned memory. His brother sold south after a failed escape. His sister beaten for speaking her mother tongue. His own body chained, bought, sold, ordered like furniture. Every moment of pain was stored inside him, like nails collected in a wooden chest. And there was another lesson he learned, one no master intended to teach. He saw how men of wealth feared the earth. They feared swamps where fevers bred. They feared storms that sent tides surging into their streets. They feared decay, rot, and above all, the grave. Their houses stood high on stone foundations, their dead interred in churchyards with carved angels to watch over them. For them, the earth was not a place of comfort, but of finality. To Solomon, earth was different. It was the one thing no man could own. Soil lay beneath slave and master alike. It swallowed rice fields and gardens with equal hunger. It buried bones without regard to wealth. And slowly, Solomon began to imagine how the very soil they despised might become their executioner. He never spoke of revenge. Not to others, not even to himself in whispers. Speaking was dangerous. Silence was safety. Silence was power. But in his mind, revenge grew patient. It took the shape of the tools he used daily. the shovel that lifted soil, the hammer that drove nails, the planks that closed a wall. These were not weapons in the eyes of his masters, but in Solomon's hands they could become something else. Each humiliation, each scar, each loss was a plank laid in the architecture of his vengeance. He did not know when it would begin, only that it would. And when it did, it would not be loud. It would not be a rebellion in the fields, muskets blazing, flames rising. Charleston had seen those and crushed them. No, Solomon's revenge would be quiet. So quiet that at first no one would understand. So patient that by the time they suspected, it would already be too late. So final that no whip, no court, no gallows could undo it. For Solomon was a carpenter, and carpenters build. He would build not homes, not mantles, not walls for his masters. He would build their tombs. The camera pans over Charleston's harbor at night. The waves slap gently against the wooden pilings, lanterns sway in the damp wind. The city sleeps, but one man does not. A pair of hands tighten around a wooden handle, a shovel. It began with what looked like accident. But there was nothing accidental about Solomon's hand. Elias Harrow was his master then, a man known for his taste for drink and his cruelty and sobriety. Harrow often struck his servants for amusement, his whip curling through the air not for discipline but for pleasure. Solomon bore his marks. One night Harrow stumbled home from a tavern. The streets were slick with summer rain, the air heavy with the stink of spilled beer and horse manure. Solomon walked behind, carrying the tools of his trade, a shovel, a hammer, a lantern. He was the shadow expected to follow. At the corner of Meeting Street, near a half-finished construction site, Harrow slipped. He laughed, cursed, and fell into a shallow trench dug for a new foundation. His fine coat smeared with mud, his boots flailed like a child's. And Solomon paused. The lantern flame quivered. Harrow's laughter echoed in the pit. And then Solomon lifted his shovel. The first clumps of dirt fell lightly, almost playful. Harrow chuckled at the joke. "Enough," he barked. "Get me out." But Solomon did not stop. The sound of shoveling grew steady, deliberate. The soil poured in heavier, covering Harrow's legs, then his chest. His laughter broke into alarm. "What are you? Stop this, damn you." Still the shovel rose, fell, rose again. Harrow thrashed, clawing at the walls of dirt. His voice turned to shrieks that split the night. And then for the first time Solomon spoke. His voice was low, barely audible over the rain. "Now you know the weight we carry." By dawn the pit was filled, smooth, flat, ready for stone. The body of Elias Harrow lay silent beneath Charleston's newest foundation. The city thought him drunk and lost, drowned in the harbor, vanished in the woods. No one looked beneath the soil that supported their new walls. The months that followed were quiet. Solomon worked as he always had, sanding wood, raising beams, silent and steady. But something inside him had shifted. He had tested his patience and it had held. He had tasted revenge and it was not bitter. His second victim was a man named Robert Maybank, a planter who fancied himself a gentleman of taste. He loved to hold gatherings in his grand townhouse, where music played and wine flowed. He often summoned Solomon to maintain his cellar, a cavernous space where barrels of wine rested against brick walls. One night, when the house was dark and the family asleep, Maybank descended with a lantern to fetch another bottle. Solomon was already there, his tools arranged neatly, bricks stacked, mortar ready. Maybank blinked at him, confused. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Solomon did not answer. He lifted the brick, pressed mortar, laid another. Slowly he began to close the cellar's only doorway. Maybank scoffed, thinking it a prank, then grew irritated. He demanded Solomon stop. But the wall rose brick by brick, the sound of trowel against stone echoing in the chamber. Panic set in when the opening shrank to the size of a man's head. Maybank shouted, pounded the rising wall, his fists thudding against stone. His voice grew muffled as the last gap vanished. The lantern's glow was sealed away with him. By morning, Maybank's family searched the city. His wife wept, his children cried. They never thought to break the wall that looked so perfectly finished, so seamless, as though it had stood for years. Inside, Robert Maybank screamed himself hoarse. Then silent. Then nothing. By the third, Solomon's design had grown darker, more deliberate. The victim was a plantation overseer named Stephen Cross. Cross was not wealthy like the others, but he was feared more than most. He wielded the whip with joy, often beating men and women until the dirt turned black with blood. One evening, Solomon offered to help him draw water from the estate's well. Cross, drunk with power and drink, accepted. He leaned over the stone rim, peering into the dark shaft below. In that moment, Solomon's hand struck, not with blade but with rope. Cross was shoved forward, tumbling down into the damp hollow. His leg cracked on stone. His howl echoed upward. Solomon did not climb down. He lifted stones instead. One by one he dropped them into the well, each crash followed by a grunt, then a scream, then a wet thud. The overseer's cries rose to pleading, then cursing, then gurgling silence. The well was capped with wood. No one ever drank from it again. By now, Charleston whispered. Disappearances spread across taverns and churches. 9 men gone in as many years, some said. Taken by pirates, others claimed. Taken by fever, by duel, by debt. But beneath the whispers was something more fearful. The thought that someone was hunting them. Solomon, however, was untroubled. He had built his patience into ritual. His revenge was not swift. It was careful, deliberate, like laying the beams of a house. He never struck twice in the same way. One was drowned in grain, suffocated by the harvest he had stolen from enslaved hands. Another was trapped beneath collapsed scaffolding, the supports sawed thin in advance. A lawyer vanished during a carriage ride. His seat ripped open, the ground beneath prepared, his body swallowed by a trench that closed over him like a mouth. Each death was different, but each was silent. No blade. No fire. No rebellion in the fields. Only soil. Only wood. Only the weight of the world pressing down until breath was gone. By 1810, Charleston had grown restless. 9 men of wealth and standing had vanished. Their families whispered of curses, of devils, of retribution for sins unconfessed. The church bells tolled funerals without bodies. The masters locked their doors tighter, barred their cellars, doubled their night patrols. They feared shadows in their own homes. They feared silence itself. And still, Solomon waited, choosing his moment, building his tombs in plain sight. For he was not yet finished. The greatest of his victims was yet to come. Judge William Fenwick, the man who had overseen the trials that sentenced enslaved men to death with the flick of his pen. Solomon's revenge was not random. It was justice, measured and deliberate, aimed at the very pillars of Charleston's power. And when Fenwick fell, the city would finally begin to dig, not just for bodies but for the truth. Charleston, 1811. The night was thick with heat. A storm hung over the city, but no rain fell. The air clung heavy to the skin, suffocating in its own way. Judge William Fenwick sat in his grand study, a glass of Madeira wine sweating in his hand. He was a man of letters, of law, of order. His shelves groaned with volumes of English jurisprudence, Roman philosophy, scripture bound in calfskin. He was a pillar of Charleston, his word as heavy as stone. But stone had a way of cracking. Fenwick was restless that night. He had grown wary. Too many of his friends and colleagues had vanished. Men of stature, men untouchable. Gone. His sleep was shallow, filled with dreams of coffins and voices that whispered his name through the cracks in his house. The judge prided himself on reason, yet fear had gnawed through it. His servants whispered of curses. His wife prayed longer each night. Fenwick scoffed at both, but he, too, double-checked the bolts on the doors, the locks on the shutters. It did not matter, for the danger was already inside. Solomon moved like shadow through the judge's house. He had mapped its bones long before, the cellar, the beams, the hidden voids within the walls. He knew where the wood rotted, where the mortar crumbled, where silence could smother a man's scream. Tonight he carried only a lantern and a trowel. He did not need rope, nor knife, nor poison. The house itself would be his weapon. Fenwick heard nothing until the lantern's glow appeared at the edge of his study. He lifted his head, startled, wine dripping down his chin. "Who's there?" The figure stepped into view. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face half in shadow, half lit by flame. The butler. His butler. Solomon. Fenwick's voice cracked with both relief and suspicion. "Damn you, man, you frightened me." But Solomon did not speak. His silence was its own answer. The judge set his glass down. "It's late. What business brings you here?" Still silence. Still the slow lift of the lantern, the way the light crawled across Fenwick's face like a hand. Fenwick swallowed. "Speak, damn you." At last Solomon opened his mouth. His voice was calm, measured, like a verdict being read. "You have written many names into the grave. Tonight yours will join them." Fenwick surged to his feet, outrage breaking through fear. "You forget yourself. I am a judge of this city. I could have you whipped, branded, hanged." But even as he thundered, his voice wavered. For in Solomon's eyes there was no trace of a servant, no flicker of obedience. Only stillness. The same stillness that had swallowed 9 men already. Fenwick's fury cracked into pleading. "Wait. Listen. If this is about the sentences, the trials, I was bound by law. I gave judgment as the statutes required." Solomon tilted his head as though listening to the excuses of a child. "The law you worshipped," he said, "was written to bury us alive. Tonight it buries you." The judge backed away, knocking over his glass. Wine bled across the table like spilled blood. His hand trembled as he reached for the drawer where his pistol lay. But Solomon was already moving. With a calm step, he placed the lantern on the desk, its light steady. His other hand pressed down on the drawer before Fenwick could open it. Their eyes met. No words were spoken. The silence was louder than any gunshot. The judge was not bound, not struck, not dragged. Solomon did not need force. He opened the study door and gestured toward the hall. His meaning was clear. "Where?" Fenwick stammered. "Down," Solomon said. The voice was soft, but it carried the weight of command. Fenwick obeyed, his steps uneven, his breath shallow. Together they moved through the dark house, the lantern throwing long shadows that crawled across the walls like reaching hands. Down the stairs. Through the narrow hall. Into the cellar. The air grew damp, cool. The smell of earth rose strong. The judge's heart thundered in his chest. He realized where this was leading. He had heard the whispers. The men vanished. The unfinished walls. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, trembling. "Please. I am no overseer. No whip has touched my hand. I dealt in words, not chains. If you seek blood, you seek it in the wrong man." Solomon turned the lantern so its light fell upon a patch of wall. Fresh mortar gleamed wet, tools lay waiting. The judge's breath caught. His knees weakened. "You wouldn't." Solomon raised a single brow. "I would." It began slowly. Too slowly. The first brick pressed into place with a squelch of mortar. The sound was small, almost gentle, but it struck Fenwick's heart like a hammer. Another brick. Then another. The wall began to rise. Fenwick lunged forward, grasping Solomon's arm. "Stop. I can pay you. I can free you. I will sign manumission papers this very night. Your life will be your own." But Solomon's arm did not move. His eyes were fixed, his breath steady. "My life has always been my own. Tonight I take theirs back." The next brick slid into place. The gap narrowed. The judge pounded the air with frantic promises. "Land. Gold. Safe passage north. Say the word, it's yours. Only let me live." The wall climbed higher. The lantern's glow was cut by the narrowing opening. Shadows stretched longer. Fenwick's voice broke into sobs. "Mercy, I beg you. By God, mercy." Solomon's trowel scraped mortar. His voice was quiet. God watched. He did nothing. Now I answer. The wall was chest high, then shoulder high. The judge's pleas turned to screams, his fists slamming the bricks, his nails splitting on stone. His voice echoed in the chamber, desperate, animal. Still the wall rose, brick by brick, breath by breath. By the time the gap shrank to the size of a face, Fenwick was on his knees. Tears streaked his cheeks, spit foamed his lips. He called for his wife, his children, his God. None answered. Only Solomon's steady breathing. Only the scrape of brick and mortar. Fenwick's final words were not pleas. They were curses. His voice, ragged and broken, hurled hatred through the narrowing hole. "You'll hang for this beast. They'll dig me out. They'll hunt you. They'll bury you tenfold." The last brick lifted. Solomon held it for a moment, studying Fenwick's face, pale, sweat-soaked, twisted by terror. Then he placed it, pressed it firm, sealed the wall. The cellar fell silent, save for the faintest muffled pounding. Then that too faded. Solomon set the lantern on the ground, wiped his hands clean, and turned away. Upstairs, the judge's wife stirred in her sleep. She thought she heard something faint, a cry, a knock, a whisper beneath the floor. But when she rose, the house was silent. By morning, Judge Fenwick was gone. His study lay empty, his bed unslept. The city searched, the courts mourned, sermons thundered. Some said pirates took him. Others said fever or flight. But the house knew, and Solomon knew. The wall still stood. Behind it, silence heavier than stone. The camera drifts across Charleston's harbor at dawn. The sea is calm, but the city is not. Judge William Fenwick's disappearance was no small matter. This was not a dock worker gone missing after a night of drink. This was a man of the bench, a keeper of law, a man who dined with governors and senators. His absence rippled like thunder through the streets. By morning, the magistrates called an emergency session. Riders galloped across plantations, knocking on doors, asking if any had seen the judge in the night. His wife swore he had gone to bed. Servants swore he had retired to his study. None had seen him leave. But the study held no trace of struggle. His robe still lay across the chair. His wine glass sat half empty. His wig, the mark of his station, lay untouched on its stand. It was as if the man had dissolved into air. Charleston's elite bristled. For years their peers had been vanishing, wealthy planters, merchants, overseers. 9 in all by some whispered count. Always men of means, always men whose absence was explained away with uneasy lies. He left for Europe. He was seized by fever. He took a ship to Jamaica. But never a body, never a grave. Now a judge had joined their number. Too public, too high, too impossible to hide. The whispers spread like fever through the streets. They're being taken, one by one. Something is burying them. The poor spoke openly of curses. They said the earth itself was swallowing masters whole, tired of their cruelty. Some said it was the spirits of Africa come to collect a blood debt. Others muttered a name, soft, almost fearful, Solomon. But the city's rulers could not afford superstition. They called constables, hired searchers, summoned slave patrols to scour swamps, alleys, docks. Still, no trace that it was not until weeks later that suspicion turned to the houses themselves. A mason hired to repair a damp cellar in one of the vanished men's estates noticed something peculiar. A wall, freshly mortared, thicker than it ought to be. His hammer struck it and the sound rang dull, hollow. When the bricks were pried free, the stench rolled out first, sweet, choking, undeniable. Behind the wall lay bones, crumbling, gnawed by the slow work of earth. The city reeled. This was no fever, no pirate raid, no secret voyage. This was murder. Burials not in graves, but within the very walls of Charleston's wealth. Each discovery was worse than the last. Another cellar, another wall, another set of bones. Always sealed. Always deliberate. 9 walls. 9 men. 9 tombs. The pattern was undeniable. Someone was building coffins out of their own houses. The question burned, who? Not many had such skill. These were not sloppy barriers, they were the work of hands that understood weight, pressure, stone. A mason, a carpenter, a builder. The constables turned to the city's enslaved workers. Who among them had access? Who moved between houses with tools in hand, unnoticed, invisible? One name surfaced, whispered with dread and awe: Solomon. He had been in Judge Fenwick's service. He had repaired walls for the other vanished men. He had been seen carrying bricks, mortar, tools. And always he was quiet. Too quiet. When patrols came to question him, Solomon was gone. They searched the judge's house first. In the cellar, torches shook as men descended. The air was damp, heavy with mildew. Along the wall they found it, a stretch of bricks too neat, too fresh. Axes struck. Bricks shattered. The stink spilled out, overwhelming. Some constables staggered back, retching. Others pressed forward, lanterns lifted. Behind the wall lay Judge Fenwick. What remained of him? His robes clung in tatters. His jaw hung slack, teeth bared in a final scream. His hands were shredded where he had clawed at stone. His eyes, or what was left of them, stared into the black. The men staggered away, pale, trembling. One crossed himself. Another spat to chase away the evil air. There was no denying it now. Solomon had buried him alive. Charleston erupted. Some demanded blood. Hunt him down. Hang him. Burn him. Others whispered in awe. Among the enslaved, Solomon became legend. They spoke of him in hushed tones, not as man but as spirit. The earth avenger. The one who buries. They said he could walk through walls, that he could command soil to open and close at will. Among the masters, terror gnawed. If one man could do this, what stopped others? Their homes no longer felt safe. Their walls no longer comforted. Every creak of timber, every damp smell of mortar, every shadow in the cellar became a threat. Charleston's very architecture, once its pride, turned against them. But Solomon himself was nowhere to be found. Some swore he had fled into the swamps, where no patrol dared follow. Others said he boarded a ship, hidden in a barrel, bound for the north. Still others whispered that he had not fled at all, that he still walked Charleston's streets, unseen, waiting, watching. Constables arrested dozens of enslaved men in vain, interrogating them, beating them for answers. None spoke. Perhaps they did not know. Perhaps they knew too well. The city never found him. Over time, Charleston patched its walls, plastered over its cellars, cleaned away the smell. But memory lingered. Even decades later, children whispered the story: if you are cruel, Solomon will come. He will build your tomb. Servants swore they felt him near when they passed cellars at night. Masters dreamed of walls closing in, mortar sealing, lungs burning. The law wrote him as a criminal, a beast, a shadow. The enslaved remembered him as justice, harsh, merciless, but justice nonetheless. And somewhere between those memories lies the truth. A man who built with silence, who turned tools of servitude into weapons, who left behind not bodies but walls. Walls that could not be ignored. The camera lingers on a crumbling cellar wall. The mortar is cracked now, eaten by time. Dust drifts from between the bricks. The silence is centuries old, but it still clings like damp to the skin. Charleston never forgot Solomon. It could not that in the weeks following Judge Fenwick's discovery, Charleston's air grew thick with paranoia. Masters no longer slept soundly. They paced their halls at night, lanterns in hand, listening for the sound of mortar being spread in the dark. Servants were watched more closely than ever. Keys were clutched tighter. Tools were locked away. Even a mason carrying his trowel drew nervous glances. The city council met in furious secrecy. Minutes of their sessions remain sealed, but fragments survive in newspapers and letters. One line, scrawled in a planter's hand, reads, "The very walls are against us." The Negro turns his trade into terror. It was not just fear of one man. It was fear of what he represented. Solomon had proven that skill, patience, and silence could topple power without fire or armies. He had made the master's own houses into graves. Charleston's authorities responded with crackdowns. New laws restricted the movement of skilled enslaved laborers. Black carpenters, masons, and smiths were forbidden from working unaccompanied. Night curfews tightened. Patrols doubled. But beneath these edicts lay something deeper, an admission of fragility. The white elite had always imagined themselves untouchable, their mansions symbols of permanence. Solomon showed them those walls were not fortresses, but coffins waiting to be sealed. The court spoke his name only as the fugitive criminal. No official record preserved the legend of 9 buried masters. Yet, in the shadows of Charleston's alleys, his story grew. Among the enslaved, Solomon became more than a man. He became a warning to oppressors and a promise to the oppressed. In whispered songs, field hands sang, "He builds with silence, he builds with earth, he builds your sleep into a grave." Mothers frightened cruel overseers with tales, "Be careful." Solomon hears the lash. He buries those who swing it. Children dared each other to creep into cellar doors at night, whispering his name into the dark, listening for footsteps that never came. And among men planning resistance, Solomon's name became a spark. In 1822, when Denmark Vesey plotted his slave revolt in Charleston, some said he invoked the story of Solomon as proof that white walls could fall. The legend had outgrown the man. The truth of Solomon's fate was never known. No gallows bore his body. No patrol claimed his head. Some said he vanished into the swamps, where moss and mist hid him forever. They pictured him living among maroons, feeding on wild rice, a ghost of the marshes. Others swore he escaped north, that he boarded a schooner under false decks, and in Philadelphia or New York, he told his tale in whispers, a prophet of buried masters. And some, most chilling of all, insisted he never left Charleston, that he still walked its streets at night, silent as ever, watching the houses he once built, waiting for another to fall into his hands. No evidence ever proved one story above the others. His body was never found, which left only the walls. Even after decades, Charleston's elite lived uneasily with their homes. Builders whispered that certain cellars felt wrong, colder than they should be, smelling faintly of damp earth, the mortar darker than the rest. Some families quietly bricked over those spaces, sealing them twice as though another wall could undo the first. Others abandoned houses entirely, unable to endure the thought of their foundations hiding graves. The story became folklore, then warning, then nightmare. Travelers wrote of Charleston as the city of buried men. Sailors whispered of houses that swallowed their owners whole. And though polite society denied it, the memory endured where it mattered most, in the hearts of the enslaved, who passed it on as proof that even the mighty could be undone. Solomon's revenge was singular, but it revealed something vast. The institution of slavery thrived on silence, the silencing of names, voices, lives. But Solomon weaponized silence. He turned the very act of being unseen, unheard, into terror. His story cracked the facade of white invulnerability. It exposed the truth that their power, though immense, was not unshakable. Beneath the wealth, beneath the law, beneath the grand facades of Charleston, there was fear. Fear that the oppressed would one day answer. And when they did, it would not come with warning. It would come in silence, in shadows, in the walls they thought were safe. By the mid-19th century, Solomon's story had become part of Charleston's haunted reputation. Northern abolitionists repeated it as a parable, proof that slavery bred monsters of its own making. After the Civil War, freedmen told their children of him, not as monster but as avenger. They painted his silence not as cruelty, but as justice the law had denied. And today, though his name is half forgotten in books, it lingers in Charleston's whispers. Tour guides murmur of the butler who buried masters. Locals avoid certain basements, swearing the air is too close, too heavy. History may question the details. Was it truly 9? Was it truly Solomon? Skeptics argue, documents blur, facts fade. But legend holds its own kind of truth. And the legend is this. A man enslaved turned his trade into judgment. A man silenced taught silence to scream louder than any riot. A man buried 9 masters alive, and with them, buried the illusion that walls can protect the guilty from the weight of the earth. The camera drifts once more through Charleston streets at night. The gas lamps flicker. The shutters creak. The houses stand tall, their facades elegant, their cellars silent. Too silent. What remains of Solomon is not bone, nor record, nor grave. What remains is silence. Think of it. The city tried to erase him, to call him fugitive, criminal, shadow. Yet his silence outlived their judgments. He needed no army, no fire, no gun. Only patience. Only walls. Each brick he laid was not just mortar and stone, but testimony. Testimony that cruelty cannot bury memory forever. Testimony that even the most obedient mask can hide a reckoning. And perhaps that is why his story lingers. Because deep down, every man who held the whip, every judge who signed the sentence, every master who locked his doors knew, the silence of the enslaved was never empty. It was waiting, but what was Solomon? Was he a monster, burying men alive, condemning them to suffocate in their own cellars? Or was he a judge of his own kind, handing down verdicts where courts denied justice? History cannot decide for us. It only shows us the wall, the trowel, the silence, and asks us to peer into the dark and answer ourselves. If you had lived in that city, in that system, would you have called him criminal or savior? And, more frightening still, in the silence of the present, what cruelties go unanswered, waiting for someone else to take up the trowel? Solomon's name was never carved into stone, but the fear he inspired cracked Charleston's foundations more than any earthquake. For the enslaved, his legend was proof. The powerful could be undone. For the powerful, his memory was warning. Their walls were never as strong as they seemed. That duality remains. Even now we live surrounded by walls, laws, systems, powers built to seem permanent. But history whispers otherwise. History whispers that every wall has cracks, and sometimes all it takes is one silent builder to bring it down. So if you walk Charleston streets today, pause at the cellar doors. Lean close to the bricks. Listen. Some swear they still hear it, faint scratching, the echo of a last scream, the whisper of Solomon's silence pressing through the mortar. Not a ghost, not a myth, but memory itself refusing to die. And ask yourself, was it justice? Or was it vengeance dressed in silence? Was Solomon the monster Charleston feared, or the justice Charleston deserved? That is the question I leave with you. And I want to hear your answer. Was Solomon right, or was he damned? Do we call him villain, or do we call him judge? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what side you stand on, because this is not just history. It is reflection, it is warning, it is the past knocking on the walls of the present. If this story unsettled you, if it forced you to lean closer to history's silence, then share it. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel for more truths that claw their way out of the cracks they tried to seal. Because here we remind you, the past is never truly buried. And sometimes, the walls remember. Fade to black. The faint scrape of a trowel echoes one last time.